I turned 68 the morning I decided to drive to Boston. I hadn't planned it, hadn't planned anything really, but there was something about waking up alone again in that little craftsman cottage in Asheville that made my hands move on their own. The kettle hissed as I poured water over my tea leaves, the same kind my mother used to make. My living room was still decorated with paper stars from my former second graders, a habit I never broke even after retirement. A single card from the public library sat on my table. They always remembered. Brian never did. I hadn't seen my son in over 12 years. Not in person, anyway. I caught glimpses of his life through others, mutual acquaintances, the occasional article in a trade magazine. His wife, Vanessa, sometimes appeared beside him in press photos, her polished smile tight and camera-ready. Logan, their son, was a name I only saw in print. I had no voice in that narrative, not even as a footnote. We used to share the same birthday, March 3rd. For a long time, I held on to that thread like it could pull us back together. This year, something in me broke free. I pulled out a sweater I hadn't worn in years, filled a tin with lemon shortbread cookies he used to love, and drove the 12 hours north. The house stood in one of those gated suburbs outside Boston. Symmetrical hedges, American flags, cars too clean to be practical. I parked 2 streets over. When I approached the door, the sound of laughter filtered through the windows, children's voices, clinking glasses, balloons, blue, silver, and gold, danced behind the curtains. I knew what I was interrupting, but I still rang the doorbell. It didn't take long. The door cracked open, and there he was, Brian Grant, my son, older now, but still with that firm line between his brows when he was bracing for something unpleasant. He looked at me like I was a stranger from a misplaced memory. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Not angry, just finished. "I just wanted to say happy birthday," I said, the tin of cookies trembling slightly in my hand. He glanced over his shoulder. I heard the faint echo of Vanessa's voice and then a child's footsteps. Before I could see the boy clearly, Brian stepped fully into the doorway, blocking my view. "Today's not the right time," he said, almost rehearsed. "Brian, you shouldn't have come." His voice was soft, but final. The door closed with such calm that it took a moment for me to realize it had shut entirely. I stood there for several minutes, hands still curled around the tin, trying to remember how to move my feet. I'd imagined a lot of outcomes for that day. Anger, a difficult conversation, maybe even silence, but never that precise, practiced dismissal. I left the cookies on the porch, not because I thought they'd be eaten, but because carrying them back felt heavier than leaving them behind. Driving through Boston traffic with my knuckles white on the steering wheel, I replayed the moment again and again. The child's voice, the shape of the home, the way his eyes hardened not out of hate, but indifference. That was what stung the most. It wasn't that he was still angry. It was that he no longer considered me relevant. That night, back in Asheville, I placed my keys in their usual bowl by the door, hung up my coat, and made myself a cup of tea as if nothing had happened. I watched the steam rise and disappear, and I thought, this might be the last time I ever try. I didn't sleep that night, not really. I moved through the hours in that quiet, familiar house the way someone walks through an old museum, aware of every creak, every shift in light. I brewed tea I didn't drink, opened a book I didn't read, and sat for long stretches without knowing where the time had gone. There was a heaviness in my chest, not from surprise, but from recognition. I'd seen it coming for years, in the silence between birthdays, in the unopened envelopes returned to sender, in the blank space where a family should be. I had simply chosen not to give it a name. By morning, I found myself at the writing desk near the back window, where the sunrise always fell softest. It wasn't a decision, just a motion, one I'd made many times before. I pulled a clean sheet of stationery from the drawer, the expensive kind I bought years ago, with the intention of writing only important things. I wrote slowly, deliberately, not out of desperation, not to plead or correct, but to offer something I hadn't tried before, truth without explanation. I wrote about the time after his father left, when I worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. I wrote about the nights I came home too late to kiss him goodnight and sat on the floor by his bed anyway, watching his chest rise and fall in sleep, wondering what parts of me he might be learning to resent. I wrote about how I saved for his college tuition in secret and how I couldn't bring myself to tell him I was scared that if I gave too much, I'd have nothing left when he finally turned away. I wrote about Logan, though I didn't know him. I told Brian I didn't expect a relationship, only that I wanted him to know I had carried love for both of them across years of silence. When I finished, my fingers ached and my eyes burned, but there was a kind of stillness in me I hadn't felt in years. I folded the pages carefully, sealed them in an envelope, and walked them down to the post office. I chose the nicest stamp they had, not because it mattered, but because it felt right to give something beautiful a proper send-off. The letter was gone. That should have been the end of it. But 3 days later, it came back. Same envelope, same handwriting, mine, but bent, torn slightly at the edge. Inside, the pages had been ripped into several jagged pieces, not shredded, not destroyed in anger, but torn as if to say, "This does not belong here." No note, no signature. Just a yellow sticky square pressed to the front of the envelope, 5 words written in quick, sharp ink. "Stop inserting yourself into this." I stood in my kitchen, holding that envelope for a long time. The kettle had started to whistle, but I didn't move. Something inside me had gone utterly still, like a curtain finally falling. I didn't cry. There wasn't anything left to dissolve. In the closet down the hall was a box I hadn't opened in nearly a decade. It was a simple wooden chest, once used to hold lesson plans and craft paper, now full of birthday cards, with no stamps, gifts wrapped and never sent, and old photographs I'd been too stubborn to throw away. I placed the torn letter gently on top and closed the lid. That afternoon, I drove to the library for my volunteer shift. The children's section was busy as always, sticky fingers, giggles, tiny shoes squeaking across the tiles. There, I felt invisible in the best way. No one asked questions. I was just another older woman with a cart full of books and a name tag that said, Miss Evelyn. No judgment, no expectations, just tasks that ended when the cart was empty. On my way out, I noticed a new face at the reference desk. She looked to be in her 70s, with a posture too straight for comfort and eyes that scanned the room like she'd seen all of it before. She was dressed plainly, but with precision, scarf pinned just so, hands folded neatly, as if they knew how to command silence in a courtroom. "You carry something heavy," she said, not as a question, but as a fact. I looked at her. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to explain myself. Her name was Eleanor. She'd once been a litigation attorney in Raleigh, then a mediator, then, according to the way she said it, something more tolerable, retired. We began with small exchanges across library shifts, quiet nods, book suggestions, then short conversations while sorting returns, never quite veering into the personal until, one rainy afternoon, it did. She didn't ask for the story, but she knew how to sit still long enough for it to come out. I found myself telling her about Brian, not the polished version, the real one, about the closed door, the letter torn like it had never been whole, the silence that had now turned into a kind of architecture in my life. She didn't offer sympathy. She offered steadiness. "Keep living forward," she said. "He's not in the room. Don't keep setting the table for someone who never comes." That winter, I rearranged the house. Nothing dramatic. I moved the reading chair to catch the morning light, donated half the clothes in the guest room closet, painted the trim on the kitchen cabinets a pale green, the same shade as the mug my son used to steal from me when he was 13 and thought he was subtle. I still use that mug sometimes, not out of sentiment, just because it was the right size. The days fell into rhythm. Mornings began with tea, sometimes oatmeal if the air carried that Appalachian chill. Then the library, a walk by the river, maybe lunch with Eleanor, who had appointed herself my accountability partner for remaining vertical and not fading into a couch. Evenings were quiet, but not lonely. I read again, not for escape, but for engagement. History, mostly. Personal essays. Voices of people who had survived lives that didn't fit clean categories. When spring came, I planted herbs on the back porch. Basil, thyme, rosemary. They smelled like memory, but they asked nothing from me. In July, I took a bus trip with the retiree center to Savannah. I walked the cobblestones alone and sent postcards to no one. In October, I joined a local book club. We met in the basement of a church that no longer held services, surrounded by folding chairs and lukewarm coffee. Still, the conversation stirred something in me I hadn't felt in years. Curiosity, not about others, but about myself. People always imagine grief as a storm, but for me, it was sediment, layers settling over time, muting colors, dulling the edges of days. I wasn't grieving Brian anymore. I was grieving the version of myself who waited for him. That woman had left quietly one afternoon in March and hadn't returned. In January, Eleanor convinced me to enter a drawing for a senior travel grant, one of those programs funded by regional foundations to encourage intergenerational storytelling. I filled out the form with little interest, naming a vague trip along the Great Smoky Mountains, a place I'd already been, but claimed I wanted to document through essays. It was just something to do, something to turn in before the deadline passed. Then, in April, I received a letter from the foundation. I had won. It wasn't life-changing, not in the way people use that word for windfalls or miracles, but it was substantial. Nearly $180,000 in discretionary funding over 2 years. The kind of award meant for those who knew how to stretch meaning across modest terrain. My name would be listed in regional newsletters, some of which I knew found their way into Boston offices and alumni inboxes. I didn't try to hide it. I didn't try to amplify it. I just let the notice sit in the places it naturally traveled. That summer, I began planning my trips. I bought a secondhand camera, updated my passport, and replaced the tires on my car. I chose new luggage in a muted gray blue, the kind that suggested purpose without announcing money. I told the library I'd be away some weeks, but would return. Eleanor, as expected, became my logistics coordinator. Then, in early August, just as the dogwoods began to turn dry and brittle, I received an email. The subject line was blank. The sender, Brian Grant. 3 words, "Is everything okay?" I sat for a long time, staring at those words. There was no reference to the letter, no apology, no acknowledgement of the torn envelope or the closed door on my birthday. Just a question, casual and vaguely polite, like we'd exchanged recipes last Christmas. I didn't answer that day or the next, but something inside me shifted. Not a crack, not forgiveness, just awareness. The silence he had built so carefully was no longer solid. Something had leaked through, and I intended to find out why. I waited 3 days before responding, not out of calculation, at least not consciously, but because I wanted to know whether the message lingered for him the way it did for me. He had offered so little, just that vague inquiry, as if he were fishing in a shallow pond and unsure what might surface. I replied with care, brief but warm, mentioning my travels, the grant, and a casual note about adjusting to life on the move. I said I was well, and I hoped he was too. His second message arrived within the hour, longer this time. He mentioned work, vaguely, something about departmental restructuring, and then pivoted quickly to Logan. He's 12 now, the message read. Curious about his family lately. Keeps asking questions about where we come from. Thought maybe you two could meet sometime. There it was. An opening shaped like an offer, but carrying the weight of a transaction. I didn't rush my reply. I let 2 more days pass. When I did write back, I accepted. Not with enthusiasm, but with a tone that allowed room for both anticipation and caution. I suggested somewhere neutral. He proposed Boston. I agreed, even though I knew it gave him home field. We met at a waterfront restaurant, his choice, upscale but not ostentatious. I arrived early, the way I always do, and watched couples drift past the tall windows like framed memories I couldn't quite place. When the 3 of them entered, I recognized the choreography before I even saw their faces. Brian's brisk stride, Vanessa's measured grace, Logan following like a shadow that hadn't decided whether to stretch or hide. They sat across from me, polite but not warm. Brian took the lead, filling space with updates about Logan's school, his grades, his recent science fair win. Vanessa nodded occasionally, her eyes alert, measuring. Logan sat quietly, hands folded in his lap, his gaze flicking between us with a curiosity he didn't try to hide. When the food arrived, Brian shifted gears. He asked about Asheville, the foundation grant, my itinerary. He didn't mention the torn letter, neither did I, but his questions weren't idle. They were probing, dressed in civility. I answered just enough to satisfy, keeping the edges soft. It was Vanessa who eventually said what they'd both been circling. We were surprised to hear about the grant. That kind of award isn't common, is it? I smiled gently. No. But then again, quiet lives sometimes carry more story than people think. Logan watched us like someone reading subtitles on a film in a language he almost understood. When he asked if I had photos from my trips, I showed him a few. Mountains, markets, a black and white shot of a deserted train platform at dawn. His eyes lit up. That one looks like a movie scene, he said. It was the first thing he'd said all evening that wasn't prompted. After dinner, in the parking lot, as Brian pretended to fumble for a wallet he hadn't brought, and I paid the check without comment, Logan lingered near me while his parents argued softly by the car. He tugged at the sleeve of my coat and whispered, "You don't seem sick." I looked down at him, startled. "Dad said you had something with your hands, that you couldn't write letters or travel far." He glanced over his shoulder. "But you just showed me pictures from Morocco." I didn't answer right away. I reached into my purse, pulled out a card, and handed it to him. "This has my email," I said, "if you ever want to talk about anything." He nodded, eyes serious, older than 12 in that moment. Back at home, I replayed his words again and again. "You don't seem sick." What kind of story had Brian told him all these years? What picture had he painted in my absence? That night, I checked my inbox before bed. Nothing from Logan, nothing from Brian either, but something had shifted. A small thread pulled loose, and I intended to follow it. It was a week before Logan wrote, a short message, punctuated, careful, almost formal. "Thank you for dinner. I liked hearing about your trip. Morocco sounds different than anything I've seen. Do you have more photos?" I sent a few, then one more the next day. He responded each time, gradually allowing warmth to color his curiosity. Over the next few weeks, we exchanged messages like 2 people learning how to walk a tightrope between distance and longing. I never asked questions about his parents. He never brought them up. One night, he mentioned a school presentation he was preparing for his history class. "We're doing family migration stories," he wrote. "Dad said your parents came from Ireland. Did they talk about that?" I told him what I remembered. My grandfather's stories of the crossing, the way my grandmother never quite lost the accent, though she tried. I told him about the lace she kept in a cedar box, the letters in a dialect so old I had to take them to a university library to get translated. He asked if he could use those stories in his project. I said yes. A week later, he sent a message I wasn't prepared for. "You must be feeling better now. Dad said your condition made you forget things, but you remember a lot." I read that line over and over, not because I didn't understand it, but because I understood it too well. There it was, unwrapped, something that had only been hinted at before, a fiction, spoken often enough that even Logan had learned to adjust around it. I didn't correct him. Not then. I simply said that memory is a funny thing, and that sometimes it takes the right person asking for the right things. I attached a photo of me hiking the Blue Ridge Parkway last autumn, bundled in wind layers, standing beside a trail marker. His reply was quick. "You look strong." The next message was about his school. "We're doing a fundraiser soon for neurological research," he wrote. "I picked Parkinson's because of your illness, but now I'm not sure if that's right." I didn't know how to answer, so I didn't. Instead, I found myself driving to Boston the following month, arriving early to sit in the back of the school auditorium where his class would present their projects. I signed in quietly, unsure whether Brian or Vanessa would be there. The receptionist greeted me warmly. "You must be Logan's grandmother," she said. "He told us you might come." Those words caught in my chest. I hadn't heard them. "Your grandson told us you might come." In any context, ever. Not from a teacher, not from a neighbor, not from anyone who might have met me through him. I found a seat in the back row, my coat folded over my lap, hands clenched lightly as the children filed onto the stage. When Logan stepped forward, he scanned the room, found me, and smiled in that reserved way children do when they want to stay composed but can't quite help their joy. He began his presentation with confidence. He spoke of migration and memory, of stories passed down through letters and silence. He quoted something I had written to him. "Not all arrivals begin at ports," and I felt myself blink back something I didn't want to name. After the applause, as families gathered near the stage, I made my way to the hallway, keeping to the side, uncertain what Brian knew of my presence. I hadn't told him. I hadn't planned to. But as I turned toward the exit, I caught sight of him, standing by the entrance, Vanessa beside him, both scanning the crowd with urgency. When he saw me, something shifted in his face, not anger, not surprise, but calculation. He moved toward me quickly and pulled me aside, out of earshot. "What are you doing here?" His voice low, clipped. "Logan invited me," I said. His eyes darted to the hallway. "This isn't the time or place." I looked at him. Apparently, it never is. He didn't respond, just tightened his jaw and moved past me, calling out to Logan like nothing had happened. I left quietly, not saying goodbye. But I knew something irrevocable had cracked. Not because I'd pushed, because Logan had reached out, because I had shown up, because the version of me Brian had constructed, a woman too frail, too confused to navigate her own name, was beginning to dissolve in the presence of the truth, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. 2 days after the presentation, Logan sent me a message that made me stop mid-step on the garden path behind my house. "Did you know Dad told my teacher you had early-stage dementia? He said, It's why you couldn't come to anything when I was little. Why you forgot my name once. Did you ever? I stood there a long while with my gloves still on, hands dirty from tending rosemary and lemon balm. The question wasn't sharp, it wasn't accusatory. It came the way most truth-seeking arrives from a child, part confusion, part longing, part quiet test of whether the world he's been taught is the one he has to believe in. I walked inside, washed my hands slowly, and sat at the kitchen table where I'd written letters that never arrived and opened ones I never should have read. I took my time with the reply. I never forgot your name. But I forgot how to live around the silence. That's what happens when people decide they're done explaining you to others. He didn't respond right away, but when he did, it was with a photo of a drawing, a family tree assignment for school. My name was on the lower branch, just above a question mark that had been scratched out and rewritten in pencil. I used to draw annex here, he wrote. I thought it meant someone who was already gone. The drawing was simple, the kind made with wide strokes and a little too much shading in the corners. But it undid something in me I didn't know I'd braced against for so long. Not just erasure, but replacement. I had lived too many years as a ghost in a story I hadn't agreed to disappear from. Over the next few weeks, Logan wrote more often. Short thoughts at first, updates about his science project, a photo of a dog he passed on his walk home from school, then questions. Do you like winter more than summer? Did my dad ever play soccer as a kid? Why don't you talk much about Grandma Jean? I answered honestly, with the kind of clarity I would have wanted if I were 12 and learning to trust someone without knowing the rules. I told him his father was quiet as a child, but fast, that he used to race himself across the yard until his knees were scraped and his cheeks were red from the effort, that he read under the covers with a flashlight and was scared of thunderstorms until he was nearly 10, that his grandmother loved lilacs and boiled her tea until it was too bitter to drink. But I didn't talk about the parts that left bruises. Not yet. Not with him. Logan was still choosing to believe, and I wasn't ready to take that from him, not even for the sake of vindication. One evening, after a long phone call with Eleanor, I told her what Logan had said about the illness, about the lies Brian had embedded so deeply that even a child couldn't question them until someone else showed up to contradict them without words. He didn't just cut me off, I said. He rewrote me, turned me into someone too broken to reach. Eleanor was quiet. Then, in her deliberate way, she said, "Then it's time to decide who gets to author the next chapter." I didn't answer, but I kept hearing those words days after. Author the next chapter. Not demand a correction, not force an apology, simply take the pen back. Logan's next message was about a project he was working on for school. It's about identity, he wrote. I want to include something about family myths, the things we're told that turn out to be wrong. Can I use our story? Our story. 2 words that carried more weight than he could understand. I told him yes. I told him I trusted him. I didn't say how much that sentence undid in me. That weekend, I found myself going through old photo boxes. I picked out images that wouldn't raise alarms, childhood birthdays, camping trips, a snapshot of Brian with chocolate on his cheek and a paper crown askew. I mailed them with a short note. I thought you might want to see your father when he still let people love him without conditions. The envelope was addressed to Logan, not to the house. I included a post office box I'd opened under his name, one he could access once he was ready. I didn't ask permission. I simply left a path, because that's what you do when a child begins to ask real questions. You stop answering for them. You show them how to find the way back. The invitation came on a Tuesday afternoon. Tucked inside one of Brian's increasingly frequent emails. "Let's have lunch, just the two of us," he wrote. "I think we're long overdue." There was no mention of Logan, no reference to what had unfolded in the weeks since the school presentation. It was framed as a gesture toward reconciliation, but the phrasing felt practiced, measured, like someone walking into a negotiation pretending it was a reunion. I agreed, though I took my time in responding. The restaurant he chose was polished, the kind that offered linen napkins with the coffee and menus that leaned more on impression than clarity. I arrived 10 minutes early, asked for a table in the quietest part of the dining room, and ordered water with lemon. Brian walked in 3 minutes late, sleeves cuffed deliberately, jaw tight, with a rehearsed casualness that had always betrayed him when he was younger. He opened with small talk, which I let pass without much weight. Weather, traffic, the rising cost of groceries. Then, gradually, he shifted. He mentioned how things at work had been tense, how his department had been undergoing realignment. I recognized the word from every faculty meeting I used to attend when budget cuts were being softened into euphemisms. He didn't name the ethics investigation I'd heard about from Eleanor's friend, but he circled it closely, enough for me to know he assumed I was only vaguely aware. When he pivoted to Logan, his tone changed, warmer, softer. "He really values his time with you," he said. "Talks about you constantly. It's been good for him, having you around again." I nodded, unsure whether it was meant as acknowledgement or a setup, and then he leaned in slightly, voice dropping just enough to signal that we'd reached the true purpose of this meeting. He began to describe a new venture, something about consulting in the pharmaceutical marketing space, leveraging his insider knowledge from years in the field. It was, he said, a chance to create something stable, independent, meaningful, for the family. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I watched the way his hands moved across the table, confident but restless. I noticed how he mentioned startup costs only once, then allowed the number to linger between us, unspoken but precise. I tracked the arc of his pitch, not just for money, but for proximity, for continued access. He spoke of shared legacy, of repairing the past, of investing in something lasting. And somewhere in the spaces between those words, I heard what he was offering without saying it, a chance to stay close to Logan, if I agreed to underwrite the future he'd already begun to mortgage. I didn't speak right away. I folded my napkin slowly, smoothed its edges, let the silence thicken enough to settle. When I did respond, it was with a single question. "Are you offering me a place in your business or a place in my grandson's life?" He blinked, just once, but it was enough. He tried to pivot. I let him talk. And then, when the check came and he reached for his coat with the careful speed of someone avoiding the bill, I paid without comment. He thanked me. I watched him walk out with his back straight, shoulders held too high. A man trying to perform the dignity he no longer fully possessed. That evening, Logan messaged me. A photo of a science book open to a diagram of the nervous system. "Thought you might like this," he wrote. "Looks complicated, but actually pretty logical once you break it down." I stared at that sentence for a long time. It wasn't about the diagram. It was about what came next. I spent the next week watching Brian from a distance, not in person, but through patterns, his sudden warmth, the frequency of his texts, the way he peppered updates about Logan with subtle references to timelines and finances. It wasn't aggressive. He had learned to dress need in pleasantries, but the rhythm was unmistakable. He was tightening a net around something he thought he still controlled. It was Logan who changed the tempo. One night, he sent a message that caught me off guard. "Dad said you're thinking about helping with his company. He said, once things are settled, we might move. Somewhere new. Canada, maybe. The message came without a question mark, but the hesitation was implied. Beneath his words was the fear of being moved like furniture. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I printed everything I'd collected: financial statements, documents from the public record, notes from Eleanor's contact in Boston, proof of a school deposit made to an academy in Vancouver under Logan's name. I placed it all in a plain folder. No labels, no dramatic markings, just facts. I invited them to Asheville for the weekend. Vanessa answered my invitation with practiced enthusiasm. Brian's tone was more measured. "It'll be good to talk in person," he said, as if I had finally come around. I cooked the meal myself. Roast chicken, garlic potatoes, the kind of food that carried familiarity without nostalgia. I set the table in the sunroom, where the light filtered through the trees just right. Logan helped with the napkins. He asked no questions, but watched me carefully, as if trying to memorize my mood. After dessert, I asked if we could sit in the living room. The chairs were arranged with quiet symmetry. I let the silence hold for a moment before placing the folder on the coffee table. I didn't push it toward Brian. I didn't open it. I simply said, "There's something I'd like to talk about before you go." Vanessa tensed before he did. Brian stayed composed, but his eyes locked on the folder as if it might detonate. I spoke plainly. I told them I knew about the school in Vancouver. I knew about the deposit, the consultant loans, the outstanding balances, the internal investigation at his firm. I didn't accuse. I recited. When I paused, Brian tried to reclaim ground. "You went digging," he said, his voice tight. "You don't trust us." I looked at him, steady. "You made it necessary." Vanessa rose, indignant but unsure of her footing. "This feels like an ambush." I didn't respond. Instead, I turned to Logan. He sat very still, eyes moving between the folder and his father. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice flat. "About moving? About the school?" Neither parent answered quickly enough. That silence, for Logan, was the answer. I spoke again, this time gently. "You're a bright boy. You deserve to know when people are making decisions that affect your life." Brian's posture shifted. He looked tired suddenly, his face older than it had seemed at lunch. "You don't understand how complicated things have become." "Complication doesn't justify deception," I said, "especially not when it's aimed at a child." Vanessa tried to interrupt, but Brian stopped her with a glance. He rubbed his hands together, then looked down. "What do you want?" he asked. It wasn't defeat, but it was the first crack in a wall that had stood for too long. "I want Logan to stay in school here," I said. "I want weekends with him, at least one a month. I want full transparency about the situation at work, and I want all of us in family therapy, together. No hiding, no staging, no leveraging access to Logan as a bargaining chip." Vanessa scoffed. "That sounds a lot like blackmail." "No," I said quietly. "It's a boundary. You're free to decline. You can take your chances in Vancouver, if that's what you really want, but you won't take Logan with you without a fight. I've already spoken to a lawyer. I know my rights." Brian leaned back, the folder still unopened in front of him. For the first time, he didn't look like a man trying to win. He looked like a man trying to calculate the cost of losing. And across the room, Logan met my eyes. He didn't smile. He didn't flinch. He just nodded, once, as if to say, finally, someone had told the truth out loud. The morning after that conversation, the house was silent in a different way. Not the soft quiet of a home at peace, but the taut stillness of people who had run out of lines to rehearse. Brian came down first, still in yesterday's shirt, sleeves rolled, face drawn. Vanessa followed, lips pressed, carrying the stiffness of someone trying to decide whether to retreat or reframe. Logan came last, hair slightly messy, but eyes clearer than I had ever seen them. We had coffee. No one spoke much. I made scrambled eggs and toast because it gave my hands something to do, and because feeding people had always been the one form of care that required no permission. Brian barely touched his plate. Vanessa sipped tea like it was medicine. Logan ate everything on his and thanked me without being prompted. That alone told me which of them had slept and which had not. I didn't bring up the folder again. It was still on the table where we had left it, unopened. I didn't need it anymore. The damage wasn't in the documents. It was in the silence that followed their refusal to be read. As they prepared to leave, Logan hesitated by the front door. He looked at his father, then at me, and then said, quietly but with precision, "I don't want to go to Canada." Brian started to respond, but Logan held up a hand, an exact mirror of how I'd stopped him once, months ago, when he tried to wrap his need in words he couldn't finish. "I want to stay in my school. I want to see Grandma, and I think we should do the therapy, even if it's weird." The room held its breath. Vanessa shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "We'll talk about it," she said, but Logan wasn't looking at her. He wasn't looking at either of them. He was looking at me. I nodded. "I'd like that." He hugged me. It was short, awkward the way boys that age often are, but his arms tightened for half a second before letting go, and in that motion, I felt something settle. Not a resolution, not yet, but a beginning drawn with firmer hands. After they left, I sat on the porch with Eleanor's voice echoing in my head, her measured cadence always at odds with the fierceness of what she said. "You're not asking for fairness. You're insisting on visibility. That's different. That's harder." In the weeks that followed, things didn't change quickly. Brian responded to my conditions with a lawyer's hesitation, seeking definitions, clarifying visitation rights, requesting draft agreements. But he didn't pull away. He didn't run. That, in itself, told me more than any apology would have. Vanessa, surprisingly, became the first to shift. Practicality had always been her compass. She asked for a joint session before anything formal. "Just to see if this is even possible," she said. I agreed. Our first appointment was tense, structured, but not fruitless. She listened. I spoke plainly. Neither of us softened the truth, but neither of us sharpened it into weapons either. Logan came to Asheville the following month, alone. He arrived with a backpack full of books, a folder of school assignments, and a handwritten note from Brian, acknowledging the weekend was approved. The visit was quiet. We baked banana bread, watched an old documentary about shipbuilders, and spent an hour walking the Arboretum Trail, where he asked about the names of trees he'd never seen bloom before. He didn't bring up his parents. I didn't either. On Sunday evening, as we sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around our legs, he turned to me and asked, "Do you think people can really change?" I thought about that question a long time before answering. "I think people reveal themselves slowly," I said, "and sometimes what we thought was change is just the truth finally showing up." He nodded. "I think Dad's scared. Not about you, about me." "What do you mean?" "That I might like being here more than I'm supposed to." I didn't respond right away. I just reached over and gently adjusted the edge of the blanket where it had fallen off his shoulder. A small gesture, one I used to do for his father when he was half this age, curled up on the same kind of porch, in a town where all he had to worry about was whether it would rain the next day. Logan didn't say anything else that night. He didn't have to. He'd already drawn the line, and this time, no one dared erase it. The months that followed didn't offer anything dramatic. There was no apology written in grand words, no sudden warmth flooding through old cracks in the foundation. What we had instead was smaller than that, but somehow heavier in its truth. Logan showing up on time every third weekend, a text from Vanessa when he had a fever but didn't want to cancel, Brian sending over a scanned signature for a form without being prompted. It was a strange kind of peace, not the kind that heals, the kind that makes space. We rebuilt in fragments. I taught Logan how to make my mother's peach cobbler, and he taught me how to use the reminder app on my phone properly. We took up chess, mostly so he could beat me, which he did with increasing frequency. I let him paint the birdhouse out back in colors that didn't match anything around it, bright orange and electric blue, and he told me it looked honest. That made me laugh for the first time in weeks. Eleanor said it best one afternoon as we sat on her porch and watched the spring light return to the hills. You're not trying to recreate the past. You're just giving him a place that doesn't lie. It was exactly that. No rewriting, no performance, just a home with a steady rhythm where Logan could be 13 and confused and brilliant and flawed and still entirely welcomed. In therapy, things move slower. Brian remained guarded, like someone still deciding whether he was a participant or a spectator. Vanessa took notes. Sometimes she asked thoughtful questions. Sometimes she didn't speak at all. I didn't push. My goal wasn't transformation. It was clarity. There was one session where Logan spoke more than usual. He talked about the pressure he felt to choose between worlds, about how hard it was to trust affection that only showed up when something was needed. He said he sometimes felt like a translator, always interpreting one adult's silence for another's confusion. He didn't cry, he didn't raise his voice, but his hands trembled when he finished, and for the first time, Brian reached over and steadied them. That moment didn't solve anything, but it gave shape to a possibility I had stopped expecting. Outside of our family bubble, things shifted as well. The ethics investigation at Brian's firm reached a conclusion. He wasn't fired, but his position changed. Less visibility, fewer high-level decisions. From what Eleanor's contacts shared, it had been coming long before I returned to the picture. His choices had simply caught up with him. I didn't celebrate it. I didn't tell Logan. It didn't matter to him, and it didn't serve any truth we were trying to build. Instead, I focused on the things we could control. When Logan asked if he could invite 2 friends to spend a weekend in Asheville, I said yes. When his science fair project was selected for regionals, I drove him there. When he forgot his backpack one visit and panicked, I mailed it the next day with a handwritten note and 2 slices of banana bread tucked in the side pocket. None of it felt like reparation. It felt like continuation, something that had always belonged to us, paused for a while, then slowly resumed its shape. One night, as we sat watching a documentary about migration patterns, Logan turned to me and asked, "Did you ever think we'd end up here, you and me?" I didn't answer right away. The question wasn't about location. It was about resilience. "I didn't think we'd be allowed to," I said, "but I always hoped we'd find a way." He didn't respond. He just leaned his head slightly against my shoulder in that almost too old way boys do when they're on the edge of forgetting how. We stayed like that until the credits rolled. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like it was trying to remember something. Inside, I did too. But this time, it wasn't about what had been taken. It was about what had been built, quietly, patiently, without anyone needing to win. It came on a Thursday morning in late October, tucked between catalogs and a water bill. The envelope was cream-colored with no return address. My name, written in Logan's hand, was centered neatly. I sat at the kitchen table, the steam from my coffee curling in the cold air, and opened it slowly, unsure whether I was ready for what lay inside. It was an invitation. Logan's school had selected him to give the closing speech at their annual fall showcase, a tradition reserved for students whose work showed extraordinary insight into personal and academic growth. The letter was formal, but his note scrawled in the margin made it real. "If you can come, I'd really like that. Dad and Mom are going too. Just wanted you to know." There was no hesitation in me. I called the school, confirmed the time, rearranged an appointment, and laid out a simple navy sweater that afternoon. I didn't tell anyone I was nervous, but my hands betrayed me the next morning as I tried to clip on an old silver brooch. It had belonged to my mother. I hadn't worn it since Brian's college graduation. The auditorium was bright, modern, and full by the time I arrived. I found a seat near the back, tucked to the side where I could see the stage but not stand out. Vanessa and Brian were already seated near the front, Logan between them, his blazer too big across the shoulders, his hair brushed with more effort than usual. He kept tugging at his cuffs, the way Brian used to when he was trying to hide nerves behind performance. The program moved briskly, choirs, brief speeches, awards. Then Logan stood. He adjusted the microphone once, glanced at his notes, then looked out across the crowd. His voice was calm, even. He spoke about how science had taught him not just about the world, but about observation, about noticing patterns, about asking the questions no one else wanted to name. Then, without warning, he pivoted. He talked about people, their contradictions, their silences, their small consistencies that became anchors. He didn't use names. He didn't assign blame. But when he spoke about second chances not being granted by apology, but earned through action, I felt every word land in the hollows we'd once tried to fill with hope. He said that family isn't something you receive, it's something you keep choosing, even when the lines blur, especially then. He finished simply, thanked the teachers, and stepped back. There was applause, a long stretch of it. Vanessa clapped tightly. Brian sat still for a beat too long. I watched as Logan turned slightly in his seat to scan the room. His eyes met mine. No smile, just acknowledgement. And then he turned forward again. After the event, I waited near the parking lot. I didn't want to intrude, but I wasn't ready to leave either. Logan found me first. His jacket was unbuttoned now, and he looked younger again. "You came," he said. Not a question. "Of course." He nodded and handed me a folded program. On the back, he had written, in all caps, "Thank you for seeing me before anyone else did." I didn't hug him. I didn't cry. I just placed a hand on his shoulder and held it there. Vanessa approached slowly, her heels careful against the pavement. "That was something," she said. Then, more quietly, "He wrote that speech without showing either of us. We didn't know what he'd say." I didn't respond. She wasn't asking. Brian came last. He looked older than he had even a month ago. Not tired exactly, just exposed. He meant every word, he said. "I know." There was a pause. Then Logan turned to them both. "I'm going to ride with Grandma. We'll meet you at the restaurant." Neither parent argued. Vanessa gave a quick nod. Brian looked down, then back up. "See you there." As Logan and I walked toward the car, he said nothing. I didn't press. We drove in a silence that didn't need filling, because for the first time, it wasn't built from absence. It was built from knowing. We were exactly where we were meant to be. A few weeks after the school event, Brian called. It wasn't a long conversation. He said they were thinking about moving to a different part of North Carolina, closer to where Vanessa's family had a small cabin they rarely used. "It'd give us some distance," he said. "Maybe some clarity, too." He didn't ask for my opinion. He didn't offer more than that. I told him I understood. I did. Logan took the news better than they expected. He didn't throw a fit or argue. He just asked how often he could still visit me. When I told him that nothing would change our time, that we'd set our own rhythm no matter the miles, he nodded like he already knew. The night before they moved, he stayed over. We made spaghetti, watched an old nature series he used to love, and left our dishes in the sink. Neither of us wanted to name the ending, so we didn't. We just let the evening stretch longer than usual. Before bed, he left something on the kitchen table, a small envelope taped shut. He didn't say what was in it. After he left the next morning, I opened it. Inside was a printed photo of the two of us from years ago, before the distance, before the silences. He was maybe 7, sitting on my lap, both of us mid-laugh. On the back, he'd written, in that same careful handwriting, "You were always the beginning, not the after." I kept that photo tucked into the frame of the hallway mirror, just behind the edge, not to look at every day, just to know it was there. Time passed. I saw Logan regularly, sometimes in person, sometimes on video calls where his face grew longer, voice deeper, questions more complex. He still sent letters, still asked about the garden, still ended every message with a quiet "love you." There was no drama, no explosion, no final confrontation, just a slow reshaping of what remained into something solid. I never moved back to Boston. I stayed in Asheville, kept teaching writing workshops at the community center, kept walking the same loop around the lake every Saturday morning, rain or shine. Life didn't bloom again. It just settled. And in that settling, I found a kind of dignity that had nothing to do with being restored or redeemed. It came from walking away clean when I could have begged, from letting absence speak where accusation never reached, from building something lasting with the one person who chose to see me without explanation. One winter afternoon, Logan and I walked through the Arboretum again. He was taller than me now, his stride longer. He reached down and picked up a leaf, dry and curled, holding it in his palm like a secret. "Do you ever regret not fighting harder?" he asked, his voice low. I looked at the path ahead, the way the trees lined the trail like quiet sentinels. "No," I said. "I didn't need to win. I just needed to stop letting them decide what losing looked like." He nodded. We walked in silence the rest of the way. That was the last time he asked about the past. From then on, we spoke only of what we were making, what was growing, unfolding, lasting. People sometimes ask what forgiveness looks like. I don't think it has a shape. I think it's an edge you stop crossing, a door you stop knocking on, a room you learn to stop waiting in. And when you finally step away, really away, what you find isn't vengeance. It's quiet. It's steady. It's the life they didn't think you could build without them. And it's yours.